And good morning. Welcome, everybody. It is so good to have you here with us. Really delighted to be able to be hosting this webinar today on lobbying disclosure and alignment. Just to kind of run through a couple of the, if you will, if I can, there we go. Just a couple of the kind of structure of how we're going to do this. We'll ask you to be in listen-only mode until we offer for questions and answers. You can also enter your questions into the chat. And the webinar is going to be recorded and we'll be posting it on our website for those who are unable to be with us or those who don't want to take tons of notes immediately. Just by way of an opening reflection, wanted to kind of call to mind and heart, especially for us in SGI, the joy of this particular year. We celebrate our 50th anniversary as an organization here in 2023. A couple of sisters of the school sisters of St. Francis and Father Mike Crosby came together to form our organization, and kind of recognizing those roots, have a prayer that I've kind of adapted from another organization that I'd like to share as we begin our time together. So we humbly recognize ourselves to be in the presence of a loving God. Loving God, as we celebrate 50 years of the gift of seventh generation interfaith, we pause with grateful hearts, full of recognition that all good gifts come from you. We recognize that the good work accomplished over these 50 years is done through the power of the Holy Spirit. It is the Holy Spirit which rouses us from our cynicism, stirs us out of complacency, and moves us to respond to injustice. It is your love which moves us to dismantle systems of oppression and illuminates the path forward for our families and communities. We pray in gratitude for 50 years of solidarity, motivated by the same Spirit, calling us to lift up the weary, to love our neighbor, and to welcome the stranger. We pray in gratitude for 50 years of prophetic leadership, especially those leaders who have shared the gospel message in both word and deed, leading others by their joyful examples. We pray in gratitude for 50 years of yes that comes from a myriad of leaders in our communities, each one stepping up to lead when called by the Spirit, when called by their communities, when called by the need they saw in their neighbor's eyes. Let us stand proudly upon the shoulders of each of these leaders who have come before us. Let us move together to continue a legacy of standing together. Let us be alive in the Spirit that will bring forth communities filled with true peace and your justice. We ask this in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, recognizing where we are today, we are fortunate to have a redux, if you will, of two companions who were with us back in August of 2019. We have with us today John Keenan and Tim Smith. And I just realized looking at that while I've updated the photo of Tim, I failed to update titles, but it actually is corrected elsewhere in the slides. I just failed right there. I apologize for that, and we'll get it fixed before the final edition goes out. Also, looking at where we hope to go today, we're going to be talking about lobbying disclosures. We're going to be talking about lobbying alignment. We're going to be looking then at what we're asking for as shareholders in lobbying disclosure resolutions. And we're going to be looking at some of the other kinds of tools and practices that help us advance lobbying alignment. We're going to have an opportunity to look at one particular resolution. There are other tools that will be made available after this. And we're going to have some time for question and answer. We'll start with looking at what advocates seek. But before we get there, let me just say a few words about John Keenan, who's going to kind of lead us through these items. John is a corporate governance analyst for capital strategies for the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, otherwise known as AFSCME, which is the largest union in the AFL-CIO, representing state and local government, healthcare, and childcare workers. John serves on the board of the Council of Institutional Investors, where he previously co-chaired its Shareholder Advocacy Committee. And before joining AFSCME, he was a proxy voting analyst at Institutional Shareholder Services and a paralegal in Washington, D.C. And he's a graduate of Brown University and a fan of Major League Baseball, especially located there in the Capital Region. John, maybe I'll pass it over to you with that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. And yeah, thank you for having this panel on a topic that is yeah, an ongoing campaign. I'm going to talk about the investor campaign and ask around lobbying disclosure. So kind of going to go through 4 different things. Like, first, why investors and the public are concerned about lobbying, give 10,000-foot overview. Then talk about what investors have been doing. 3, get into kind of the company responses. And then 4, just some examples of some great work by members here who are represented and just kind of ongoing action. This is like a long-term campaign that, as we've gotten into it, has really kind of just exposed why we need this greater disclosure. So yeah, with that, I'll start on why investors are concerned with lobbying. Like, basically, what is it and why is it important for investors? Corporate lobbying is used to influence regulation that affects all aspects of the economy. It can be used for good or for bad, on issues from climate change and drug prices to financial regulation, immigration, workers' rights, even such things as proxy voting and fiduciary duty, all that kind of stuff, like the attack on ESG, that winds up being in this mix. So basically, it's ongoing. Companies say, hey, we have to do this. They come up with ways to influence regulation policymakers at the federal and state level. And yet the picture for investors, a global survey of companies, so this is, outside of US as well, shows that only 8% of companies are disclosing their lobbying spending to investors. So that means that this is still, despite all the work that's been ongoing, we're only scratching the surface, and companies are not disclosing this very important information to investors. So, like, looking at political spending, you have lobbying and you also have political contributions. I believe, Tim, and there'll be some mention of the political contributions part, but it's good to understand how they're, distinguished, how they're looked at. Political contributions fall into a legal framework and are reported with the FEC. Whereas lobbying falls into, there's a federal register and there's lobbying reports, but then there's also regulations at the state level. So really they're interrelated, because if you can give political contributions, you can also lobby. So that can lead to a quid pro quo kind of situation where an interest is saying, hey, this issue is really important to us. That's why we're lobbying you on it. And oh, by the way, we're allowed to give political contributions as well. So kind of put the two together. But in orders of magnitude, lobbying outweighs political contributions 10 to 1. The political contributions seem to, get a lot of attention, and rightly so, but the lobbying is far more substantial, but it's not necessarily reported on as much. People know about it. What kind of figures are we talking about? At the federal level, 3.5 to 4 billion in the last year spent on lobbying. What are we looking at the state level? The state level is more difficult to get a picture of, because you have 50 different states and you have 50 different disclosure regimes, but we're also talking billions of dollars there too. And with that, it's kind of, the media has been decimated. There aren't reporters at the state level. So for companies that want to have an effective lobbying strategy, state level can fly under the radar and can produce a big bang for the buck. And many industries kind of do this heavily, that, phone companies, tech, pharmacy, drug prices. So state lobbying is a really kind of under the radar and an area where investors need more. And it's kind of, a little bit more of the Wild West. But then what is the other aspect of lobbying? So, you have these direct sources, but what, else is going on? And that's where you get to the trade associations. And then, as we've learned, another group, social welfare organizations, which are also allowed to lobby. And the biggest trade associations spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year lobbying using corporate money. So it's kind of, that becomes this area of influence that becomes very important in the disclosure that investors are asking for. And it can lead to, just, it's almost like influence laundering is how I compare it. And it winds up being, when investors ask companies for disclosure, like the biggest area of pushback winds up being the third-party disclosure. And that's these monies flowing through the chamber and pharma and the National Association of Manufacturers, that sort of thing. So with that, there's a lot of lobbying going on. So what have investors been doing? And to address this, since 2011, we've been doing a lot. AFSCME looked at this and said, hey, there's these political contributions. We need to also get at lobbying. And we came together with Boston Trust Walden and members of ICCR and started this as a campaign that investors needed more disclosure. Since 2011, over 500 proposals have been filed. What are they asking for? They're asking for board oversight of lobbying, like describe that, but then also federal lobbying, state lobbying, so the amounts by year, but then also, and here's the important thing, is the third-party lobbying through trade associations and social welfare groups. So any money going to a third party that is used for lobbying needs to be disclosed to investors, and companies don't like to disclose that. That's always been the area of pushback. And then one final piece, we realized that there were, groups lobbying that were set up as 501c3s. So it also asked for disclosure of any payments or contributions and memberships in tax-exempt organizations that write and endorse model legislation. And this captures a group like the American Legislative Exchange Council, which, back when we started this proposal, had done this stand your ground stuff that led to basically the murder of Trayvon Martin and others, I'm sure. And there was a great pushback, and companies left ALEC after they were presented with these proposals saying, hey, what are you doing there? So investors have been pushing this, about 40 to 50 proposals a year, and it's been moving the needle. But as we've been doing it, it kind of just winds up, you're peeling back layers of an onion, and you realize there's a ton of stuff going on. So yeah, you have the American Legislative Exchange Council. We know that now they're behind the model legislation in the war on ESG and working with these other groups. But who's members of ALEC? Pharmaceutical companies like Eli Lilly. But then the crazy thing is, so it winds up being like, a doll within a doll situation. All the major trade associations are on the private enterprise board of the American Legislative Exchange Council. So the Chamber of Commerce, BlackRock's a member of the Chamber of Commerce. They're on the board of ALEC. ALEC is producing this, craziness that's attacking BlackRock, JP Morgan. Who else is on there? National Association of Manufacturers, pharma. So a company can leave a group like this, but they're still there by dint of, their membership in a trade association. So it kind of, these groups all work together. So anyway, leading up, what are we looking at in 2023? Like the campaign kind of just keeps going on because we cannot get a disclosure bill passed at the SEC because companies have put in a rider saying that they're not allowed to produce rulemaking that would give this disclosure to investors. So we have to do it piecemeal, private ordering, and continue to just do this where it's like you wait and then an example happens and First Energy makes $100 million bribe through a social welfare group. And now, there's people going to go to jail. They're facing huge fines. But then, you just say, all right, well, do other utilities do this? And First Energy, no, not First Energy, Next Era in Florida, they're accused of funding ghost candidate scandals and giving money to 501c4s. Going to be a lot of people in trouble. DTE Energy, all these things. So it's kind of just alphabet, they support 369 trade associations, social welfare groups, and nonprofits. Some of them are involved in the war on ESG, the Independent Women's Forum, Federalist Society. So it just shows you that, there's all this influence, but investors are asking for disclosure of the amounts to make sure that hopefully what gets disclosed, what gets measured, gets managed. And yeah, you see what happens. Like, so, and then kind of what have the responses been? It's an evolving scale. We started out, companies say, no, we don't want to do this. You look at the example of Exxon, and there's been a lot of great work on climate, on getting better board members. But people have been asking, investors have been asking for lobbying disclosure for 10 straight years. And it started out at 24%, then it got to 30%, then it got to 40%. And then 2 years ago, it finally got the majority, and they got new directors on there. And Exxon, which had pushed back against this, now is producing a report that has its federal lobbying, state lobbying broken out by state, and then all the amounts going to trade associations and social welfare groups. And when you add it up, it's over $29 million. So it shows you, and that's all being used for political lobbying purposes. But, their lobbying number that they disclose federally and at the state is only like $9 million. So that means there's like $18 million going somewhere else. So you learn so much more as you go along. But then there, Walt Disney this year, like Mercy Investments has been there for years. And finally, I think, I'm not sure it's public, but yeah, their disclosure has improved. And it's kind of this persistence. Comcast and, Friends Fiduciary. We never thought we would get disclosure. And finally, after 5 years of talking to the company said, okay, we see what you're talking about. We'll do the trade associations. We'll do the social welfare groups. And voila, we got disclosure. But then, like, just kind of looking at the history of this, there's like been some great moments, like, and with seventh generation, like the first majority vote was at Alliant Tech Systems. Father Mike picked up on this issue and said, hey, I'm going to file these proposals and start looking. And they were like I guess a bullet manufacturer, and they support the National Sports Shooting Foundation. So it's like bad stuff, like, anyway, questionable. And he got 65%, and like our heads nearly exploded. And this was like in 2013. So then, but then you kind of slug away and you don't get results. So another great example, Midwest Capuchins at Boeing, and they filed, the company said, oh, we don't even need to talk to you. Never improved their disclosure. And then next thing you know, they're having these horrible tragedies where the planes are crashing and hundreds of people are dying. And now the company is in trouble, and they'd lobbied against FAA regulation, had a revolving door. And now, brother Robert, through his persistence, is getting more attention. And the proposal went to, I was expecting it to, people to see the argument. Anyway, it went to 30, and now it's over 40. And now the company is talking. And there's many other such just great examples of the work. Trinity at Altria. Altria still leaves some stuff out. They don't want to do the social welfare groups. And if you look at who they're giving to, there's some questionable, anyway, they're not doing that. But then they disclose all their state level lobbying. Mercy also at Honeywell, all of a sudden the proposal got to 48%, and the company said, you're about to get a majority. So now they disclose their trade associations, the social welfare portions used for lobbying, and the state lobbying, which, as I mentioned, is the hard one to get. Zevin at Walden, all sorts of good stuff. But for a long part of it, like Boston Trust Walden has really led the way. But then my co-conspirator, co-partner, Tim, has moved to ICCR and is now assisting there. And it really, so it's this one aspect of political spending that we're trying to get. But then as you start to look at that and realize it, you realize that there's all these other issues that come up, company purpose, company statement. What are they lobbying on? Is there alignment with the groups that they're involved with? And, that I think Tim is going to get into some of that, but they're totally legitimate and valid questions. But I view it as, you need to have the alignment, but you also need to have the disclosure of the amounts so that you can make sure that this stuff is being managed and that there's not something that's kind of being, swept under the rug per se. So with that, I think, I hopefully have covered a lot of it, and I will pass back to you, Chris, to give to Tim.
Hey, thanks, John. And I should add, before saying anything else, of those 500 resolutions and about 50 every year, SGI members are filing and co-filing typically between 10 to 12 every year of those, and leading a handful of them. But we'd never be able to do it without the regular and faithful assistance of John and Tim in all this. And so introducing Tim, who in this group certainly needs no introduction, but I'll do one anyhow. Tim is one of the founding staff members of ICCR, and he's been a leader in our field for more than 5 decades. He currently has returned to ICCR as senior policy advisor, where he supports ICCR's work around responsible political engagement, deepening engagements with asset managers, and responding to the pushback on ESG, the attacks on ESG that John was referring to, as well as serving as a mentor for ICCR members and staff. Tim was with ICCR for 30 years, including 24 years as its executive director. And in 2000, he went to Boston Trust Walden, where he led the organization's shareholder engagement efforts for 22 years. In 2007, 12, and 13, Tim was named one of the top 100 most influential people in business ethics by Ethisphere Institute. In 2010, he received the Bavaria Award for impact at the 3rd annual Joan Bavaria Awards for building sustainability into capital markets. In 2011 and 12, he was named one of the most influential people in corporate governance by the National Association of Corporate Directors. In 2016, he received ICCR's Legacy Award for his enduring record of demonstrated influence on corporate policies. Tim also has a theological background, having earned a Master of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary. So with that, why don't I pass it on to Tim?
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Gosh, I'll hire you as my PR agent pretty soon. It is really wonderful to be able to see so many friends, old and new, and to feel these connections across the airwaves here. And I'm very excited to be on this webinar with you in my new role, as Chris described, as Senior Policy Advisor at ICCR. And in that work, I continue to work with John on lobbying, and also help coordinate work on political spending, which we'll talk about. But also we're very heavily involved in combating these anti-ESG attacks. And that's an appropriate phrase to use. These are serious attacks with billions of dollars of money of investment capital being pulled out of the accounts of companies who practice ESG. The umbrella title that we're going to see evolving now a little bit more is corporate political responsibility. So as John noted, lobbying and political spending for elections are joined at the hip. But they are two separate entities too, and these have been run as parallel connected campaigns over the years. But at least ICCR is going to attempt to put this under one umbrella and continue the dual paths of work. ICCR's agenda on lobbying has been member-led. John has performed a yeoman's task over the years. I've tried to be a faithful assistant there. And at this point, we're really pleased to be able to acknowledge that this will become an official ICCR working group now that there's staff, myself, and I think one of my colleagues, Asaba, who's on the line from ICCR, will be working in this space too. So we'll be there to try to help you, continue to help you, but give additional help as you negotiate with companies, or as you work to attend annual meetings or do research and so on. It's really exciting to see the growth and expansion of the work on lobbying. John's given you a wonderful summary of the work focusing on the lobbying laser focus. And we've seen many more agreements, as John noted. We've seen votes rising to a very respectable level. And some big institutional investors beginning to get the idea that a company's reputation is at risk if they have policies and positions on certain issues, but then they find their government affairs office or their trade associations are taking them in a different direction. So that's been an aha moment, I think, for many. We also see continuing resolutions on political spending. And I'm just going to quickly focus on that, Chris, so that people can see the two sides of this coin. So there have been requests for years, I guess, John, over a decade with the Center for Political Accountability, asking for companies to disclose their political spending. And we've seen much more agreement on that initially, a comfort level with companies doing that, perhaps because some of that information was in the public domain anyway. But at this point, we're also seeing more of a focus in the political spending side on the question of consistency and alignment. In other words, as a company says that it's committed to progressive policies on climate, but it is supporting members of Congress directly and indirectly that may be climate deniers or working against climate legislation, that's a contradiction. And of course, as ICCR members are well aware, there was a deep and growing debate after January 6th and the insurrection about whether companies should continue to give money to election people seeking office who were election deniers, or even some who seemed to be supportive of the insurrection. There was a pause in political lending for quite some time, political contributions, excuse me. But at this point, many companies have gone back to business as usual, giving money to candidates if they see fit. So you're going to see new questions being raised this year, or continuing questions being raised about the inconsistency between companies saying that they have a policy commitment on an issue, but then maybe are supporting members of Congress that are going in the other direction. I want to broaden the debate now as we talk about lobbying to talk about climate lobbying, and my colleague Tracy Rembert from ICCR is on the call. Tracy is a staff person working full-time on this issue in the climate working group at ICCR. And it's quite significant that we have staff and attention being paid to the key issues of climate lobbying. Tracy's just come out with this marvelous study that's well worthwhile looking at. Long time in the research, looking at how companies have tried to address their lobbying practices and related to climate change. So you're filled with examples here, as well as a roadmap about where to go. And this year, just so people know, because we're talking about lobbying, John can refer to the lobbying disclosure resolutions, but there's close to 20 resolutions being filed by investors on climate lobbying too. These are resolutions, just as John noted, increasing votes occurring that have been getting significant votes over the last several years, including majority votes at places like ExxonMobil, Chevron, and so on. And this has resulted in more and more companies doing reports that aren't A+ reports, but are beginning to really not just disclose information, but assess their responsibility as a trade association member, for example, about what those trade associations are doing in their name with their money on climate lobbying. And my old firm, Boston Trust Walden, Laura Devaney's on the call with us, took a lead with a number of companies last year that had successful engagements. So ICCR has resources here, climate lobbying through ICCR and the Environmental Group series, key issues with more and more investors understanding as you work on climate, you need to address policy issues too. Now, this is not just an aha moment for investors, right? Hundreds of companies get it, that if they are to see their climate goals come to fruition, they need public policy that backs them. So, for example, you would hear Mary Barra, the CEO of General Motors, often talk about the need for meaningful public policy so that they can meet their goals of transitioning to electric cars from combustion fuel engines. Very significant kind of understanding in the business community. But that general understanding needs to be put together with companies really looking to see how they can make positive, do positive work in their public policy advocacy on climate policy. And secondly, how they can make sure that their trade associations, or as John mentioned, some of their not-for-profits they support, how those organizations also are consistent with a Paris-aligned public policy and not trying to undercut those. We have a long way to go there too. So it's important at least to acknowledge at this point too the tremendous pushback that we're seeing from a number of red states attorneys general and governors, like the governors of Texas and Florida. The governor of Florida said the other day, reminded us that Florida is the place where woke comes to die. So he's describing people who have woke agendas, meaning politically correct agendas on issues like gay and lesbian rights and issues like critical race theory and climate change. These are not appropriate issues, he believes, in the investment process. Well, as you said, Christopher, members of seventh generation for 5 decades have had a different premise, that in fact their faith and values and their fiduciary duty should affect how they make investments. So I'm going to go finish off with just a couple of examples. One of them is one that Christopher has on the slide, and it's a resolution Boston Trust Walden put to UPS, a company that's very widely held. And I know they've been in meaningful discussions with the company on this issue. But for the first time, I think quite cleverly, the staff team there decided to merge the issues of political spending and lobbying in one resolution. So they've asked the board to disclose information. But remember, when you're asking for disclosure, you're asking the board to pay attention and to evaluate what's happening in this space. So look at it, UPS's criteria governing direct and indirect lobbying and political expenditures. But then what's the company's process for evaluating the incongruency or the misalignment of its lobbying and its political expenditures with UPS's own public commitments and policies? So for example, UPS has, let's call it forward-looking, they can always go farther, faster on climate, but how are they taking their climate goals and comparing it to what they are doing through trade associations and these not-for-profits as well. And then, as you've seen, the reference that John referenced earlier too, what are we members of, and to trade associations and tax-exorbitant organizations engaged in lobbying, but also the drafting of model legislation. And here's where the American Legislative Exchange Council comes into play, because they have been promoting the anti-ESG bills all around the country. Their bills have showed up, I think, in over 25 state legislatures, and they actually have supported the ALEC annual conference. And just with Altria, UPS and Altria are the 2 big names that have supported that conference. So anyway, here's a different kind of combining of the points, but in the same family, right? Trying to see what this misalignment means. And on Alphabet, a resolution led in part by Zevin Asset Management and Boston Trust Walden, we are seeing a resolution asking Alphabet to describe its framework for identifying and addressing misalignment between Alphabet's lobbying and on the climate issue. So again, Alphabet has I would say, a very forward-looking position on the issue of climate change, and yet its policies are in terms of who it supports and where its dollars go, maybe undercutting those. So Chris, we could make these points again and again through other examples and the good work you all have done, but I think that we're at our point where we wanted to turn over to discussion.
Yeah, thank you both, John, Tim. These have been wonderful ways of kind of helping us launch into some conversation and hear from the participants that are here. I'd welcome your questions, or even if those of you who filed some of these resolutions or are engaged in these resolutions have some comments that you want to add from your wisdom and experience. Just either raise your hand or put something in the chat. You don't all have to do it at once. Well, maybe I'll just, Laura's there. So go ahead, please, Laura.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, John and Tim, of course. Great webinar. I do have a question about trade association activity, because it's a live wire, right? I focus a lot on climate. So I am kind of coming with this question with that kind of lens, but broadly speaking, we saw a big, say, federal legislation package passed last year, the Inflation Reduction Act. And so there were a lot of good things and a lot of lobbying that happened around that legislation, but there's still a lot of opacity about how and where the big trade associations weighed in. And then looking ahead, right, there's questions about how they may be weighing in on additional policies, climate or otherwise, on the most pressing issues of our time. How are they weighing in? How should folks think about kind of keeping track and synthesizing and kind of noting some of the big actions that those trade associations may be doing, and how should we take those talking points to the companies that we're engaging?
I'll be glad to start off, and John can add in. That's a great question, Laura. As you know, too, you can't figure out day by day what the Chamber of Commerce or the National Association of Manufacturers or others are doing on climate. Sometimes it slips out, but it's not self-evident. Thus, the request for the kind of transparency that you all have promoted in these resolutions asked for is very important, because it's really asking the companies we own to be putting pressure on the trade associations to be public about what they're doing, but also for them to assess, okay, I'm going to look at the chamber's role in the last year or the last 2 years. I'm going to make an assessment about whether the chamber is acting in a positive or negative way. Now, we also recognize that many companies are faithful members of their trade associations and don't like to be critical of them. So it's a heavier lift for them to be publicly critical. But we have had even companies like Exxon note that their own policies are partly misaligned with what their trade associations are doing. Then other companies saying there's a definite misalignment. And then we've seen a handful of companies actually withdraw from trade associations where they feel that there just is no willingness, no openness to redemption, and no willingness to change. So I think that coming in and pushing companies to say, as a member, with your member dues, we want you to hold the trade associations accountable is important. And meanwhile, public scrutiny too, and investor scrutiny on these trade associations is important as well.
Yeah,
John, anything you'd add?
Just to follow up, like Tim summarized it all very well in a good nutshell, but yeah, as to what you can see as to what they're lobbying on, like when you actually look at a federal lobbying report, it just says, infrastructure. Doesn't say, hey, we lobbied to lower taxes or to, get the. So it's really rather inscrutable from the actual reports, but then there's also great resources out there and groups that look at what the chamber and American Petroleum Institute and so groups like Influence Watch and Influence Map and like really recommend their resources. And then as Tim says, you get this response, oh, we're the good guys on the inside, we're working to change them. With the alignment report, some companies are saying this is a bridge too far. Then other companies basically say, well, we're just there, for tax policy, and we don't care about their crazy anti-ESG stuff. We're not touching that. But drug pricing at the state level is a very important reason for us to be there at the table. But having them justify that puts it on the table. But yeah, to your original question, it's a little bit of a black box.
But increasingly, as you say, public scrutiny by the press and others on what the trade associations are saying and doing. So, but both the difficulties, Laura, and then the abilities to find out some information we hadn't seen before. I see one chat, Chris, and I see.
So there's a question in the chat about media strategy. And I guess my first observation is sometimes the media brings to our attention things that we were unaware of. So when we think about like a recent reporting in the New York Times regarding the National Restaurant Association and the trainings they would do for servers around food safety and the like, and that was actually funding lobbying efforts against raising the wages of those folks. Your thoughts on relationship with media, but also maybe ways that the media helps us.
Well, I'm glad you started off that way, because indeed the media is a resource for all of us, isn't it? Whether it's the Guardian, which is now newspapers are global, and we can get a story from the Guardian that's useful for us, as well as the New York Times. I think we can be pleased that some of our associations that we're part of, ICCR series, attempt to have fairly aggressive media outreach on these issues. So Tracy's report that I mentioned earlier was sent out to the press, and we announced the shareholder resolutions that are being put, and any agreements that are worthwhile get highlighted as well. So I'm glad Jean asked the question. There certainly is an eye toward the press almost every day. And we, Laura's mentioned a few here as well.
And John, you have anything you want to add on that?
Oh, just on media, yeah. It's I don't know. It's like our story is there, so it's really nice when it gets picked up on in the media, and I think that we're touching on a lot of really important issues. Framing can be important too, like with the tech companies at Amazon last year, lobbying got over 50% when you take out the insider vote, same at Alphabet and same at Meta. And these companies are like, if a journalist just goes, oh, the proposal lost, and it's like not telling the actual story that this got a majority. So it kind of seems to me that, yeah, we need to, anything we can do more to help elevate this, because it really kind of undercuts and is, at the cutting edge of a lot of the things going on in the world.
John, say a sentence more about the inside votes. Not everybody might understand that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so at a company like Facebook, the founder, Mark Zuckerberg, controls 70% of the vote. And the proposal got like 20% of the vote. So that means like it got 2/3 of the outside vote. And then Zuckerberg, and same thing at Alphabet, like the founders own 60%. With Amazon, I think Bezos owns only 10% or something, but you can consider it a thumb on the scale. And then when you actually look at what the actual votes are, and there is a majority at Netflix too. So there's actually like we're on a roll, and people inside corporate governance get this, but the media sometimes just is looking for a fast story.
And
Same thing with
ICCR is going to start
Tesla.
reporting this too, Christopher, so that from now on, this point that John's making, it doesn't have any legal reference at the SEC, but it's certainly a public relations point, isn't it? If you can show how significant the outside vote was. Sorry.
Yeah,
Christine.
well, and to the list of companies, Tesla is another one where the CEO has a very large number of shares, although apparently declining in recent times. I see a hand up with Christina. Oh, she just went out. Oh, Christina, can you go ahead and offer your question or comment?
Yes, I'm here. First off, I'm sorry to have arrived late. I'm curious if there's been any discussion or if any folks are working on kind of global lobbying and not just US centric lobbying. I'm with some of us, except we're renaming ourselves ECHO. I don't know why, but that's a different story. We are I'm very involved with our disinformation team. So we target some of the big social media platforms. We have resolutions on at Facebook, Alphabet, et cetera. But we're very concerned about the role of lobbying in those settings and dealing not just with US lobbying, but in situations like the lobbying in Europe around the Digital Services Act, et cetera. So.
Yeah. John, please.
Great question. It's the answer is it's on the radar, and investors are looking at it too from a global perspective. But the disclosure in Europe is different than the disclosure here, and we actually have a more rigorous or standardized. Europe's not where we are yet, but I think that it needs to be looked at. You can look up in the EU register the dollar amounts and euros being spent. And your point, Christina, the tech companies are 8-9 billion million euros, but they're coming out on top in Europe. And then within that, there's reporting in global press basically saying that the third party think tank strategy that's employed that we see here in the US is also a global phenomenon, and companies are running shadow campaigns, astroturfing, that sort of thing. To the north, Cher and Kevin Thomas has looked at Canadian lobbying with oil firms there. So yeah, to answer your question, it's to me it's another area that needs greater definition, and I think investors are looking at this, but you're very right to focus on that. And at the same time, like within this ask, some companies actually do report on their international lobbying, but it's not as evolved, I guess you could say. So, but great question.
I'll just add a point that some of you are familiar with the Climate 100 Plus organization, which was been formed over 5 years ago. Huge investors around the world working on climate change with over 150 companies. Now, all of those companies have as part of the focus from the investor group what they're doing on lobbying, whether they're in Europe or Canada or the United States or Australia, right? And there's been quite a bit of action in other countries like Australia and as John's already mentioned, Europe. So yes, it's not coordinated from the US and quite properly, so it shouldn't be. These are actions being taken in Australia by investors or Canada or the EU, but there's a lot of cooperation.
Yeah. I also want to point out in the chat, for those who hadn't seen, Laura shared a handful of really great resources, and I would echo that they're all excellent. And like John put there, Judd Legum is great. Even this morning, he was putting out a little bit more around some lobbying contributions from, I'm blanking out a little bit on the context right now, but there's more reporting in some ways than you can shake a stick at. And oftentimes, sometimes we like, as John pointed out earlier, we were in place with a resolution at Boeing before some of their dirty laundry got aired. And there are plenty of other industries where there are issues of alignment kinds of questions. Like we talked about the restaurants recently, but then within ICCR, there are a number of members that are also filing pharma alignment resolutions, pharma lobbying resolutions. I don't know if John or Tim, you want to make a comment about those resolutions as well and the kind of subspecies of those?
John?
Yeah, are we talking about the pharma lobbying?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's just, you look at an issue and there's somebody coming in on this. So the drug pricing comes up a ton. So you look at, companies say, hey, we're for people getting medicine, but then you look at a bill in California to allow negotiation for state drug plans, and $100 million gets spent by pharma to kill it. And the same thing happens in Ohio. And then like through the actual, some of the disclosures, like journalists pick up on it, but yeah, there's the alignment there. Also with pharma, like, child formula and baby food, and Abbott's lobbying to lower safety standard regulations, and then you have a plant shut down and there's a shortage. These issues just come up over and over. One that's top of mind, and I think ICCR had already pinpointed, is train safety. And now we have a town that has basically been suffered an environmental nightmare that's going to last. And did the company lobby to lower the safety regulations for braking that would have prevented that? So it goes on in any industry you basically look at.
And it actually was train lobbying that Judd was writing about this morning. Other questions from those here with us, or comments?
I'm going to add one, Chris. I'm sorry, there was somebody ready. Go ahead.
No.
Okay. So at the upcoming ICCR conference, which I know you and Natalie will be at, but also it will be, I was going to say televised. It'll be is streamed. And there will be a session on this whole corporate political accountability issue and trying to bring together some new voices. There's a woman named Elizabeth Doty who works for a group at the University of Michigan called the Herb Institute, and they have come out with a set of principles about political spending and lobbying that I think will be very interesting for people to hear about. And then Bruce Freed, who we worked with for a very long time, will be talking about what an initiative they have urging companies to endorse a model code. So I think that you're going to hear some new perspectives on that hour and quarter session if you'd like to stream in.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And this is just one of those issues that is so basic. I know, John, you often speak about the importance of just simply good corporate governance leads to better outcomes for companies and for investors, and something that both the questions around disclosure and the questions around alignment on this are so fundamental. As we're getting close to the top of the hour, do you have a final word you want to of encouragement or invitation to those who are listening and joining in?
So I saw there was a question about the anti-ESG legislation, and it's just important to note that this is growing. It is an attempt to say that it should be illegal for a state pension fund, for example, to either hire an investment manager or itself take ESG into account in making investment decisions, or even their proxy voting, right? So this is a growing campaign, but obviously investors on the other side are not laying down. There's everybody from the unions John works with to state treasurers, to religious investors, and of course, big investment managers who have a real stake in this too. So it's quite a coalition pushing back. some of these model pieces of legislation are moving through the process in North Dakota or other states and have been blocked. They have, interestingly enough, some local bankers associations have been deeply troubled by them and spoken out against them. So they are not surging ahead unless you have somebody like the governor of Florida, who's basically declared this is what will happen at the state pension fund level, or the governor of Texas. So we're taking it very, very seriously. ICCR has a program on it, and we've set up a coalition with 100 organizations working together on it. So that's the positive part, and lots more to be seen on this one, Chris, through ICCR and others as well.
Yeah, I think it was Bob Eccles who recently, with an article in the Harvard Business Review just last week, maybe talked about let's make ESG boring again.
Yes.
Precisely because the kind of attacks are not helpful for people who are investing, for people who are saving, or even just for good practices. But it is something we do need to pay attention to and respond to vigorously. So I know that Alan, who asked the question, is coming from a deep red state of Kansas, so it's probably something very close to what he's experiencing there. Just to make the invitation, also know that each year when these 50+ resolutions go into companies, through ICCR, we make known the opportunities to file and co-file these resolutions. Joining at the conference in March or the conference in October, we can get updates and about the opportunities for those filings and co-filings. And I can say from personal experience, knowing that Tim and John stand with us on these makes it a lot easier to kind of work through that process with these companies. So we are immensely grateful for both of you being with us today, but also for the long time that you've stood with us in this very important endeavor. So thank you all. It's great to have you with us. I will send out, I'll finalize a deck with the resources that we've pointed to, and we'll send that out to everybody who's registered for the webinar, as well as a recording of this. A final word of thanks to John and Tim for being with us, and thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, and I'll answer questions.
Thank you, everyone.
Question offline.
So.
Great, thank you.